Opioid addiction is a national public health crisis that affects individuals and families regardless of their age, race, or income. The statistics are overwhelming. More than 130 people die from opioid addiction every day. But there is hope. Recovery is possible. The information contained in these podcasts is solely for informational purposes and should not replace advice from a medical provider when making healthcare decisions. This podcast contains opinionated content and may not reflect the opinions of any organization this podcast is affiliated with. We will discuss opioid use and opioid treatment, which may be triggering for some listeners. Listener discretion is advised.
In Season 2, we'll be focusing on the next generation of young people facing the opioid crisis. On this episode, we discuss opioid use disorder's impact on family. Mary details how Eluna supports children and families impacted by grief or addiction. And Briana speaks to the challenges her family is facing with her sister's journey to recovery, the importance of hope in terms of supporting her sister, and advice to any person with a sibling beginning a journey of recovery. I'm your host, Heather Major, and this is Someone You Know. Well, thank you both for being here today for our next episode in the second season of our Someone You Know podcast. We're continuing our conversations around support for the next generation of young people who are facing the opioid crisis. I am personally and professionally thrilled to be joined by Mary FitzGerald, CEO of Eluna, a nonprofit organization with a mission to support children and families impacted by grief or addiction, and Briana Cunningham, public affairs specialist at Independence Blue Cross. Before we get our conversation started, it might be nice to have both of you introduce yourselves for our listeners.
Hi, I'm Mary. It's a pleasure to be here. Thanks for inviting us to participate. We have about 50 partner organizations across the US and Canada. We run 3 programs for kids between the ages of 6 and 17, Camp Erin, which is a grief program, free weekend camp for kids, Camp Mariposa, which is a free weekend camp for kids impacted by the disease of addiction, which is in 18 locations across the US and Canada. And we have a resource center that offers free personalized support for families impacted by addiction or grief.
Hi, I am Briana. First of all, thank you so much for inviting me to be part of this and giving me the opportunity to tell my story. It's very personal, but it's very important to talk about these types of things. So hopefully someone out there gets something out of this. That's all I can hope. As you mentioned, I'm a public affairs specialist at Independence Blue Cross. So I've been fortunate enough to work alongside the foundation and all the incredible work they've been doing in the world of substance use disorder. But on a more personal level, I have a younger sister who has been involved with substance use disorder since she was around 18 years old. So I think we're going on about 5 years now. And it's just been a roller coaster journey with my family. I do come from a family of 5. And so being the oldest sister, it's been quite the journey and a continuing one at that. We're still, dealing with these types of things each day and just trying to navigate it the best we can.
Well, thank you both for being here. I mentioned that I'm personally and professionally thrilled, and it's because I get the great privilege of working with both of you in your professional capacities, but to also know you personally, and you're incredible people with great passion and who are doing great things. Mary, you have a leadership role at Eluna. You are the CEO. Can you give our listeners a little bit of background of what led you to become the CEO?
Sheer luck. It's really an honor. I've been here about 6 years. I like to say I'm an escaped attorney. So, I got out before they wore me down, but I've always had a passion for physical health, and Eluna really attracted me. Was at a time in my life. My brother had just died of colon cancer when my son was a month old. And, my nephews went to a grief camp. So I was familiar with Jamie Moyer, but it was really through Independence Blue Cross when I was at running another organization, I found out about the Moyer Foundation, which then we rebranded to Eluna. And I just thought, what an amazing program really to focus on mental health and physical health of kids and, have that holistic approach and come together. And I just thought, this is so needed. I had spent many years at Pop Warner football, and we would say to our coaches, you may be the only positive influence in a child's life. And I see that, here at Eluna, and I see our volunteers and our partners and everyone living that. And it's such a privilege to be a part of it.
I've had the great fortune of being able to see one of the camps that Eluna runs, and it truly is special. And the people and the young people and the volunteers who are there are just incredible in what they do and how they do. So Mary, you've been doing this for quite a while. So I'm sure you have lots of things that you could share here, but what would you say were some of those primary challenges and trends that you've really been kind of extracting from your work with families who are impacted by addiction?
Yeah, I think the one thing people maybe can take a broader view on is that there's not just one issue, right? Addiction, most of our kids that are coming in, over 75% of them have had mental health issues in the family, right? Growing up, they've had over 70% of them have had a death in the family when they were young. We're dealing with a parent who's incarcerated, a parent who's perhaps, in rehab, a parent, a family that's in poverty. So there's so many more issues. And that's really why, our goal is to break the intergenerational cycle of addiction. So I think it's easy for people sometimes to silo, nonprofits. That one's, helping, find safe housing for people. But, our kids, they're just dealing with so many of these issues. 86% of them qualify for free school lunches, right? And then COVID hits and kids aren't in school anymore. What do you do? So there's a lot of trauma. And I think that's the one message we want people to know. And it really does take collaboration and working with other organizations, reaching out, that's going to make the difference for these kids' futures.
Right. You're really impacting their lifespan, not just a moment in time. And I think that's so critically important with these types of programs, is that you're looking at their potential and trying to support them in ways that they can reach that full potential. And so, Briana, you have a very, a story to tell too. You have a very personal story about your sister and your own experiences and your family experience. And we're so grateful that everyone has agreed to, be this voice and be here today through you. And just wanted to know if you could tell us a little bit more about how you've been impacted, how your family's been impacted by substance use disorder, and honestly, the journey of recovery.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, as I mentioned, I come from a family of 5, and we live in a small town in South Jersey. And we really were like the picture perfect family. We were super close. We did everything together. We were super involved in the community. And we were just, from the outside, what people looked at as, that perfect family. And that's really what it felt like growing up. And so then around 2018, my middle sister, she graduated from high school, and she moved out of the house. And she really always had a struggle with her mental health and with fitting in. And that was something, at the time, we didn't really know how to address. We just, figured it was a teenage phase. So she moved out of the house, and we thought everything was fine and well. She seemed to be doing really great. She was, working a lot. But what we came to find out is that that's when she started dabbling with some different types of substances. And then it kind of escalated from there. And next thing you knew, she was using heroin. And it kind of hit us out of nowhere. So since then, we've really just kind of done our best as a family to navigate just this really scary journey. And something that, I don't think anyone is necessarily prepared for or knows how to handle until it's right in front of them. And it's something that's still ongoing. I mean, she is not in recovery yet. But that's the journey we're heading towards.
And that's the best thing you can hope for, right? Some days is just a hope for the next day. You're both talking about some similar things here, and I want to sort of tie them together. So Mary, you and the great people at Eluna and the wonderful programs that you operate are really about breaking that cycle of addiction for the next generation. Do you want to share a little bit more about the practices that you use and the uniqueness of the programs that you have?
Absolutely. I think in listening to Briana, one of the most important things we teach kids, and I think family members need to hear this too, is it's not your fault, right? Anything happens in a family and they think it's their fault. And I think that's something that, we need repeatedly, to share with kids. And what we really teach them, the crux of the program is coping skills. I didn't cause it. I can't cure it. I can't control it, but I can take care of myself by celebrating myself, making good choices, right? It's all about the hope, that you just mentioned. Our name Eluna is about bringing light into the darkness, right? Like the Desmond Tutu quote, the power of hope is so important. And just even, for kids in our programs and maybe some of our urban locations, getting them out of their environment and bringing kids to a camp and they've never been there before. They've never swam in a lake. We've had kids, which was heartbreaking to hear, who they didn't know what a s'more was. Kids said, well, Santa Claus isn't going to come to camp because he's never come to my house before. So just letting them see that there is, other options out there for them. And, I think one of the most powerful things, and with COVID and with all of us that, have been isolated or more physically distant, we do a letter writing ceremony on Saturday evenings called Dear Addiction, which comes out of the NACOA handbook of, kids writing their letters to addiction to get their feelings out, because that's such a big part of the program, is to express your feelings. And when you see, and it's raw and it's emotional, and, some of the things that I've heard, a 9-year-old experience, whether it's sexual abuse or, dealing with living in a shelter because of addiction, or, one camper shared that they can't even eat oatmeal anymore because that's all they could cook for their younger brother when their parents left to go to the store and didn't come home for 3 days. So it's very powerful, expressing feelings. And so many, we do reflection cards with the campers at the end of the camp. And having a 9, 10, 11-year-old, we focus on 9 to 12-year-olds for our Camp Mariposa program. And then there's a junior counselor program when they turn 13. But sharing that, my dad passed away from overdose, my mom's in treatment, but this program taught me that I'm worth something. And, if that's anything we can do in our own power individually or through our programs, that's really the goal.
You're incredible, and the work that you do, Mary, is incredible. I've seen this program in action, and it is incredibly moving for all those reasons and more. You can see children, their mindset changing and the way they see themselves in the world and their place in the world changing, and that is, truly incredible. You mentioned feelings, and Briana, we've talked before about feelings around this, right? About how do you feel, and it's not so much about, your own feelings, it's your family, and you're the oldest. Do you want to share a little bit more about that aspect of addiction in the family and being the older sibling?
Yeah, absolutely. Mary, I really resonated with what you were talking about, with it being not your fault and remembering that you need to celebrate yourself. And I think that's been the biggest learning experience for our family. I think when this all first happened, it was like a fire alarm went off and we forgot to make a plan. And everyone was kind of running around trying to figure out what the next step was. And in that situation, there was a lot of butting heads. People had different ideas of how to approach it, and how do we communicate with her, and what's our next step. And I think in that moment, instead of banding together the way we should have, we all kind of broke apart, which, addiction and the way that it affects a family can be incredibly isolating. I think that really affected my mom the most. Obviously it's her daughter, and, she takes a lot of pride in the way she's raised her kids. And so when this happened, she didn't want to talk to anyone about it. Like I said, we were that perfect family. We can't tell anyone that this is happening. And so instead of talking about it, she kind of turned into herself, and she stopped getting out of bed, and she stopped going out of the house, and she stopped communicating with, family and friends. And because of that, friends fell off, and all of a sudden she was alone. And I think, she talks about it now because, we're in that healing process as a family, that that was one of her biggest regrets, is that she didn't know what to do, and taking that step as a mother, she wasn't there for us the way that she used to. And so, yeah, as you mentioned, being the oldest, there were some times where I had to kind of take on that role. I mean, thankfully, my sisters were old enough. I wasn't necessarily a caregiver. I was away at college. So again, that feels helpless in and of itself. I was, in New York, and this is happening in South Jersey. So there wasn't much I could do, but, I was just getting phone calls every day from each family member and hearing a different side of the story and what was going on, and just trying to be that rock that was there for each person. And I think it was especially difficult. I mean, obviously, watching my sister go through, the stages of substance use disorder was heartbreaking. But my youngest sister was kind of in that formative years of her life, where, she was going to prom, and she was, picking out colleges and all these really important milestones in her life. And a lot of times she just kind of pushed off to the wayside because we were so focused on my middle sister. And so I think that was one of the hardest things, and me just trying to be there for her all the time. And it works for so long, but eventually, you have to feel your own feelings as well. And so that was, again, just a really hard thing to navigate, and something we're still navigating. But thankfully, we have learned a lot and been able to start healing those relationships. I mean, my younger sister and my mother now have a really wonderful relationship and talk openly about kind of what happened. But yeah, in those beginning years, that was really tough.
Yeah, thanks for sharing that. There's a lot there that I know other families and other people can absolutely relate to, just in the family dynamics, right? And I would invite both of you to answer this. We'll talk about programs and resources and communication, and where do you go? What's your, if you were giving advice, what would your advice be? Where should people turn, if indeed there's it's new, new news, or it's an ongoing issue? What do you suggest?
Well, it's more encouraging now. I'll say that people are sharing more, right? When you see an obituary of someone whose son or daughter died of overdose, and they're sharing that, it is normalizing the experience. So the more of that we see, I think the more people will be able to look around in church or, at a ball game and know that, so many people, right? We have almost 9 million kids that have at least one parent with a substance use disorder in this country. And, most of a quarter of our kids have more than one family member with a substance use disorder. But like we were saying before, we're focusing on prevention at specific levels. Then, how do we get support going through? And I think in listening to some of your other guests, right, that's always it. We want to shepherd people through from whether it's the prevention stage, the intervention stage, the treatment stage, recovery. And we have to work with other organizations. So we've, collaborated with a lot of different partners like, Sesame Workshop on the Resource Center, but offering support. And what we do, or we offer on elunanetwork.org, is put in your zip code. And it's a very highly curated list of where can you go around to get support. But we're always there by phone too, to say, listen, we have professionals you can talk to. Our partners, as you mentioned, are amazing. We work with everyone from, boys and girls clubs, and excited to announce our new Philly partner, which is Jewish Family Community Services, which we have a great relationship with down in Florida. But there are so many organizations out there. And I just really want to see the same level of support rise up from the communities and letting people share that, which I am really encouraging to see a lot more of that over even the last year or two.
That's great. Briana, how do you feel about, where to turn, what to do? You've personally experienced it. What would you give as advice?
I think the most important thing is education. I think my family had this really outdated narrative that only bad people use drugs. And so we had to relearn that and reshape that narrative. Heather, my mom, talks all the time the praises of the foundation and everything she's learned from the work that you guys have done. She attended one of the walks that the Someone You Know group did, and listened to all of the kiosks. And I think she was really inspired to start sharing her story. And I think it's incredibly important because she was just talking about it the other day, that once she started to share, she realized how many people were experiencing the same thing. And, so Mary, like you said, sometimes you look around in church and you can see who else is suffering. Obviously, it's not a good thing that all these people are experiencing this, but it does create this community where you feel like you can lean on one another, and you can share stories, and you know that you're not alone in that. So education has been incredible in the family, and just learning that it is a disease, that when my sister lashes out and says things, it's not her, it's the substances that are speaking. So that's been really, really important. I think the other thing is movies and media, and like a true portrayal of what substance use disorder looks like. Again, it's one of those things where it was either glamorized or it was,
Demonized.
Really, exactly. Mm-hmm. Beautiful Boy is a great example. And I know there's a lot of, yes, a wonderful movie.
Mary gave me that book to read, just so you know. She's the one who said, hey, you should really read this. And I needed like 14 boxes of tissues, but yeah.
Oh yeah. Oh yeah.
Yeah.
But yeah, and I know there's, more coming out, which I think is really important, that people are seeing that and understanding what the reality is. But besides that, I mean, we turned to a couple of different caseworkers, which were incredibly helpful. Just again, sometimes you come to a crossroads where you're not sure what move to make or how to approach the situation, and just having a professional to talk to about that is really, really helpful.
Mm-hmm. There's so many powerful statements and sentiments between you both. I keep coming back to social stigma, and you talked about changing that narrative, and I'm incredibly proud to have been involved in our foundation's work through someone to break that social stigma through positive storytelling, real people, real experiences, but again, not glamorizing or demonizing, just presenting the reality of what all different types of people, walks of life, status. This is a disease. It affects everyone. It does not discriminate. And I think that that's part of what's kept us going as a team, especially with this podcast, is that we need to keep talking about recovery. That recovery is possible, and you can approach recovery. In active addiction, it can be a part of the journey, and preventatively, it's also part of the experience. So that's why you're both here today. And I invite you to share anything else about stigma. I think you've both done such a beautiful job articulating, but if there's anything else you want to share about your thoughts on stigma, progress is being made. We need more progress, certainly. But from where both of you sit, you have married children and families interacting with your program and with your teams. Do they talk about stigma? Does stigma come up commonly in your conversations?
You can't avoid it. I think it's and that's just the tip of the iceberg almost, right? Stigma. But imagine, especially being a tween or a teen or a young kid, how important language is to you when you say your parent's an addict, right? Versus your parent is suffering from the disease of addiction. Your parent has an opioid use disorder. The semantics, I applauded the Philly Inquirer last year when they said they're going to stop, or the year before, I don't know, we lost a year somewhere, that they're going to stop using the word addict. And, the same thing. And, not that your parent committed suicide, they died by suicide. It's just so important, the framework of what kids hear and how they process that, and going back to, thinking it's their fault, that, the active language there. And, we held a community conversation around addiction last fall, with some of our parents and our kids, and Claudia Black, who helped, implement and design our program. And one of, our junior counselors, who was a former camper, just shared like, oh my God, I didn't want to tell any of my friends what was happening in my house because I was so embarrassed. So, the more our young people too can share that, and it's so refreshing hearing them share those stories at camp, right? Because you're giving them a voice, and they're ready to be heard, and they want to talk to each other, and they want to help each other. And seeing that through all levels of adulthood is just so important.
Yeah, you're both talking about some of the emotions, embarrassment, fear. I've heard, both families and young people be fearful of their family splitting apart because of, addiction. What are some of the other feelings or emotions that either you've experienced, Briana, or Mary, you've experienced through your work or through your friendships and networks?
I think you really hit it on the head with fear. I was actually, just making some mental notes for this. And I think when this hit our family, everyone experienced it a little bit differently and reacted a little bit differently. But the underlying feeling between all of us was that fear of the unknown, of the worst case scenario, of doing the wrong thing at the wrong time, and just not knowing what was coming next. And I think, yeah, I think the fear was the worst. But along with, the stigma, I think by not being able to speak to other people or thinking you can't speak to other people, you feel like you're walking around with this dirty little secret that sometimes it gets so strong inside that you just feel like you're going to burst if you don't get a chance to talk about it. So not really a feeling.
No, I think there's a feeling there. I mean, I felt it. I think that, it may be hard to articulate, but, there's shame, there's embarrassment, there's fear, there's worry, there's anxiety. There's, a ton of anxiety from, I guess, more of the lack of control that can plague us on different levels, on different days, for different reasons, at different moments. I think that's a really good thing to have in our minds as we talk about COVID, right? This whole environment that we've all been existing in over the last year plus. So many things I think we've learned, good and bad. So many things we're still learning about how to best support ourselves, and to support our families, and to support others. And I would love to hear from both of you, direct experiences in terms of addiction and substance use disorder in COVID, and maybe more what you're seeing and what you're reading and what you're learning about, and how we can pass that along to our listeners.
Yeah, talk about not being able to control things. Last year, when COVID hit, it was scary because, especially with our kids in the addiction prevention program, they coming to camp and seeing each other and coming back, and, that letting the kids come together and be kids and have fun and learn activities while they're getting therapeutic activities. It was the whole basis of our program. So, while we were able, through Brian Moss and Latoya Ford, who run our program, worked with all of our partners to move it online. And, some of our camp partners did a weekly meeting with the kids, some did weekend camps, but, all of those feelings you were just talking about, kids being embarrassed of perhaps, their household environment, right? Kids being afraid to share online. We were really, I'll say, happily surprised how much they did share and participate. And the volunteers, and I just can't say it enough, it's National Volunteer Week, were incredible, and really just lifting their spirits and finding ways to connect online, which certainly does not replace the in-person, but they went out and delivered care packages to the kids so the kids could still do art activities. We did mindfulness online. Like so many people, you found a way, and keeping that camp connection strong, and letting them know they're not alone, they're part of the community, that the isolation was really, really concerning for us.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. Briana, you're talking about this multifaceted dynamic of family. How are you, and how was your family, and how was your sister affected by the pandemic?
Yeah, I think the biggest hindrance towards the recovery was the isolation of the pandemic. Around right before this all happened, my sister had just gotten back from a rehab that she actually really loved. She had made it all the way through the program, but decided she wanted to be closer to family. She didn't like being, down there, alone with all of the possibilities of relapse. So she came back home and was starting to hang out with a new group of friends and was doing really, really well. And then this pandemic hit, and, everything ceased, and she was in the house alone. And that's when the relapse happened. And she went right back to where she was before. Just, she's alone with her thoughts and with everything going on. And that was the easiest way out. So it's definitely had an impact. And usually in those cases, we'd want to go be there with her or pick her up and take her out to lunch, just remind her that, she has a family that's there, that's loving, and that, is going to do anything we need to help her. But unfortunately, that wasn't really an option throughout all of this. It was tough and continues to be tough.
Yeah, I think, Mary, you said something that I think we can all sort of get our heads around and our hearts around, is you find a way, right? And you find a way for to deal with situations as they come up, because that's, part of life. But more specifically with the disease of addiction, it's not all planned, right? It's not a planned thing, but you find a way. And Briana, with the journey that you're on, you find a way to still be the great older sister, older sibling. You find a way to, to still be you and to shine through. And you find a way to be there for your sister, however it is, if it's, a virtual coffee now or then, and will be soon, hopefully a coffee in person. I like find a way. It makes me feel very hopeful. Just that there's always a way, right? But I think the find part of that is really important, because it makes you feel like there's something there, there's an action there that can be getting you moving forward again. You both are tremendous in what you're doing, who you are, what you've experienced. And we're so very fortunate to have you on this podcast. And again, I can't say it enough. I'm so very fortunate to have you as friends and as colleagues. We talk a lot about hope, right? And this find your way forward. What's the future? What is your hope for the future, Mary, for children who are impacted by substance use disorder and their families? And then Briana, again, I can't tell you how many people are going to appreciate your positive voice here on this issue, and just want to get from both of you your hopes.
Yeah, don't give up hope is the most important thing, right, Briana? And you're doing the best you can. But these kids give us so much hope. We learn so much from them, and we hear this all the time. And you visited camp, you get more out of it than they do. It feels like sometimes, and I really do have a hope that, just as easily as we can bond, with a stranger on a plane about the weather or our sports team, people will share that I'm in recovery, or I don't drink. And, I grew up and, there was alcohol in my family. That's really, these kids are so much better at sharing and being open and communicating and letting families know that it's okay, and letting other kids know it's okay. And we see that on many levels. And I think that's really my hope, is that they are going to be the ones that eventually break the cycle, right? Our program, 99% of the kids are staying out of the juvenile justice system. 94% of them aren't using any substances to get high. Those are incredible numbers. And I'm not saying that to brag, because it's all the kids. It's really them making the decision that they are going to do this because they know that there's a better future for them.
Right. And you have a big role in that, Mary, you and your teams and your volunteers, because, without tools and resources like yourselves, first and foremost, and obviously the evidence-based programs that you operate in the resource center, there would be a lot of kids who wouldn't have the tools or the strategies or that refresh, right? That camp is incredible for so many reasons, but it gives kids, like you said, an opportunity to be kids, and all kids deserve that for sure, to be safe, to be cared for. It's incredible. That is truly hopeful to me, that with the right kinds of people getting their arms around, the next generation, that Mary, I think you're right, that this is how we're going to change and break that cycle of addiction, and allow our kids to thrive, because that's really what it's all about in the end, is to be able to thrive. And Briana, you've been through a lot, and yet you are one of the most kindest, sincere people I have ever met. And when I remember when we first met, I thought, wow, this girl has it all together, and was very surprised when you wanted to share with me your personal story. And I was very grateful that you wanted to share with me your personal story. And to be there just to listen is such a privilege. It really is. And to have you on today is an even greater privilege. And I thank you and your family again for your willingness. I know you have a lot of hopes for the future. And so I was hoping that you could share that. Again, you have many perspectives on this, right? From this very dynamic space in which you are as a sibling, as a daughter, and obviously as you. And I would love to hear your hopes for the future and for your
Yeah.
sister.
I think my biggest hope is that we can all learn to have a little more patience and a little more grace for those that are struggling with their mental health or that are going through, experiencing substance use disorder. It's not easy. It's not easy for the families that are helping them along with the journey, and it's certainly not easy for the person who's experiencing it. I've heard my sister say time and time again, I don't want to do this. I don't want to do this, but it keeps happening. And so just continuing to have that patience and to lift them up and to help them achieve recovery is really all you can do. And I think, from the outside world, if you don't know someone who's experiencing this, when you encounter someone, just continue to practice that patience and continue to practice that grace. Don't give up on them. And I think the other thing is focusing on hope. There's so many scary stories in the news and as you mentioned, in obituaries where people are overdosing, and as a family member, it's hard not to focus on that. But the foundation again has provided us with so many stories of hope, and so many stories of success that those are the ones you really have to latch on to and know that it's not over yet, and there's always an opportunity to make that switch. And just I remind my sister every chance I can that there's still an opportunity for her to turn her life around. She's still so young and has so many talents and so many passions that, if she can just put this demon behind her, then she can pursue them, and we'll be right behind her as she does. That's my biggest hope.
You all are, you give us great hope for who you are and what you do. But I think more importantly, it's with such love that you do what you do, and that makes a big difference. It makes a big difference. And Briana, I'm very proud to be able to say to you that you're now a part of those positive stories, and so others are going to be looking to you, hopefully through this podcast and other opportunities, for that hope. It's so important that both of you are here today, and again, I'm forever grateful. I think the world of you. So I want to thank you both for your honesty, your integrity, and all that you do, the passion, and of course, for giving us the message of hope today as we continue to talk about substance use disorder and the next generation facing addiction. How do we support them? How do we empower them? How do we position them to make sure that they are the generation that breaks the cycle of addiction? And really they're the ones that are going to show us how it's done, and hopefully we can be there to provide guidance, support, and this incredible message of hope. So I just want to thank you both again, and I hope that you will join us for another episode.
Thank you, Heather. Briana, it was beautifully said.
If you or someone you know is suffering from opioid addiction, please visit ibxfoundation.org/SYK. The link is in our show notes below.